So good afternoon, everyone. I'm honored and delighted to be here this afternoon to make this presentation. And I'm going to try and share some experiences from my work in the region. I just want to say this is a very important moment for me because I'm going to be reflecting on my journey in mainstreaming gender in climate change and disaster risk management, the lessons learned and opportunities for partnerships. So this for me is a milestone. I've not worked directly with FLACSA before, but I know very much of your work. I want to reflect on my early experiences, my work as an adult, and I want to look at some concepts that we've been talking about. We heard yesterday that nothing is fixed and frozen, and we must think of critical thinking as we redevelop new concepts and ideas. I want to look at some of the commitments that guide the work that we've been doing in the Caribbean, some case studies from teaching, research, and publications, as well as advocacy and training. Looking at some lessons and challenges, but opportunities as we move forward. So, I confess, my mother was born in Camagüey, La Gloria, to Jamaican migrants, and I grew up hearing about her early experiences. I had the honor of bringing her back many years ago. She's now passed in 2016, so I'm dedicating this to her. I also want to honor my father, who followed a year before, for the gender experiences in my family, the gender equality experiences, which let me know that there are these stereotypes that can be overcome. I also want to pay tribute to Norman Gervin, a friend of Hopeton and myself for many years, and there's work in his center here, and I honor him because he has been a very good mentor and colleague and friend. So my own experiences have been working in development with a number of sectors. The first, the Caribbean Conference of Churches, where I learned about disaster preparation and response and training. Then I worked as coordinator of the Association of Development Agencies, which is a civil society organization. And there we did training on hurricane straps, building capacity, roofing, agricultural replanting after disasters. I also worked with Christian Aid in the UK, which is the development arm of the British Council of Churches, and I covered Latin America and the Caribbean, particularly Peru, Bolivia, and all of the Caribbean region. And that taught me about resource mobilization. So when they had Hurricane Gilbert, they deployed a team to come to Jamaica to then develop films, interview people, to raise money to respond to this. And when I came with the team, it was like a scene from the day after. And I looked at the different impact of the hurricane on livelihoods, on the lives of men and women and children. But my own experience has involved working with CUSO, a Canadian development agency, and providing that kind of support and response to communities. Out of that, we had the St. Peter Claver Women's Housing Cooperative, which was formed as a result or one of the outcomes of Hurricane Gilbert. So these women working in the free trade zones as garment workers were displaced by the hurricane, and churches and NGOs worked with them to build and renovate houses that empowered women to be able to manage their households. So they were no longer dependent and vulnerable and can be, being chucked out, but they had the opportunity to rebuild their own lives, look after themselves, and they were able to organize around a housing cooperative. And that for me is one of the positive things that has come out of Hurricane Gilbert. I documented this experience as part of my PhD thesis at the London School of Economics and Political Science, which taught me the importance of multidisciplinary research. Multidisciplinary research and action research. So the work that I've done is not about just publications on shelves, but it has to transform societies. And similarly, in gender and climate change, that has informed the work that I have done at the University of the West Indies. So when we talk about sex and gender, and I'm just going to give you a summary of some of these concepts that we talk about, which mean different things to different people, and related to gender, climate change, and disaster risk management. So historically, the concept of sex, gender was sex, and we have had to do a lot of work on reconditioning people's minds to say that sex is not just, well, sex is biological and gender is social. We have had to have people understand the agents of socialization, the early experiences in the family which shape your approaches, your identities, and how those socially constructed differences can be discriminatory. The power imbalances that creates in the household is then replicated in schools and the rest of society. The media reinforces these images. Excuse me. So we teach the difference between sex and gender, and it also helps us to challenge the stereotypes about what women can and cannot do. So we have learned, for example, that women can do is construction. We have had experiences of women learning construction skills in a post-disaster period because it empowered them, it gave them alternatives to household work, because we have also done research with household workers, and it gives them more autonomy as well as income. We look at rights and entitlements and power relations, but the social, economic, and political and environmental inequalities are things that we stress in the work that we do in terms of building awareness of gender. Another concept is gender mainstreaming. We've been talking about it for the last 2 days. And it's a UN concept from 1997. It's a strategy to assess the implications of a planned policy or program on males and females to promote gender equality. But it's also a process, and we've been talking about data. It's a process of the importance of collecting disaggregated data to understand to do an analysis of that to see who needs what, where, and how we can use it. So I'm reinforcing these concepts. They're not fast and frozen, but it helps us to understand the why and how to use it to understand vulnerabilities. So gender mainstreaming seeks to promote this gender equity, which is fairness, to transform gender relations and promote social justice and human rights. I underscore that because human rights is a perception, is a perspective from which we operate as we do gender and climate change, and mainstream gender and climate change. So what we're doing is equipping persons with skills and abilities to use these concepts. First of all, to understand them, but to use them in practical ways. We've been also talking about intersectionality, a term originally conceptualized by Kimberly Crenshaw, but recognizing that people have multiple experiences. In the Caribbean, we look at age, race, ethnicity, gender, class, socioeconomic status, but also sexual orientation and disability. It explains different ways in which these factors interact to create systems of oppression, domination, and discrimination. So these concepts are tools, are things that we use as part of our basic core training as we build capacity of individuals to mainstream gender and climate change. A simplified version, this is not the scientific version of it. But essentially, climate change is attributed to directly or indirectly to human activity that alters the composition of the global atmosphere. And disasters, the difference between hazards and disasters, there's a lack of capacity to manage a natural hazard. So if you cannot manage it, if you don't have the capacity to manage a natural hazard, it means that you have a potential for a disaster. Also important and linked to our commitment to human rights is underscoring what we have committed ourselves to at the global level. So the CEDAW Convention, the Women's Rights Convention on eliminating all forms of discrimination against women, is part of what we share. Then there is a Convention on the Rights of the Child. Children's rights must be part of our climate change and disaster risk management work. And here we're using gender as a cross-cutting issue. Similarly, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And I just want to pause and say that the Caribbean Development Bank and SALISIS, where Norman Gervin was director, is in fact embarking on a program on disaster disability assessment in 4 borrowing member countries. So the week after, I go to Grenada to conduct some workshops, validation workshops, because we've been doing quantitative and qualitative studies in St. Lucia, Grenada, Trinidad and Tobago, and in Jamaica. Now we work with organizations of persons with disabilities because they have to speak for and inform any kind of policy and program on climate change and disaster risk management. Excuse me. The SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, these 17 goals that we're committed to, is another framework that we use systematically. The Hyogo framework on disaster risk management, United Nations Framework Conventions, the Kyoto, and we heard about the Sendai. All of these are commitments that we use. But we also recognize the fact that gender-based violence is a critical part of climate change and disasters. And therefore, the Belém do Pará Convention is something we say, here are some tools you can also use. Here are commitments you can also use. Similarly, the Palermo Protocol on human trafficking is also critical because we know there's an increased risk of human trafficking and child trafficking when there is a disaster. We have seen numerous experiences of this within and outside the region and globally. And my work on human trafficking has told me that we have to factor that into any kind of policy and program on climate change, disaster risk management, and gender. And of course, there's the Madrid Declaration on Aging. As we go through demographic aging, we're living longer, but it means that there are gender differences, with women living an average of 5 years longer than men. So when we're thinking about climate change and disaster risk management, we have to factor in our aging population of males and females. Excuse me. To complement those global commitments, we look at national commitments. What are the national commitments, and is there policy coherence? Is there liaison between what we have made commitments to at the global level and what we do at the national level? So in the case of Jamaica, we look at our national policy for gender equality, working with them together rather than apart, because we tend to work in silos. And what this gender, climate change, and disaster risk management space offers us the potential to do is to do a lot more cohesion, coherence. And the gender ministries and departments tend to be left out. So I'm saying that it is important for us to always work with them and integrate them into whatever is being done. We look at policies and laws and various programs and strategies as well. But the bottom line is to overcome silos. Now I want to just briefly look at some of the Caribbean vulnerabilities. Here we see the Haiti earthquake of 2010. It's more than 100,000. It was more like 300,000 at the time. A woman with her baby, totally frustrated. And wherever we are in the world and see a disaster like this, we need to think of ourselves in those spaces, our own families, and how it's going to impact us. So from one day to the next, your entire life can change, right? What are some of the vulnerabilities of a country like Jamaica? And we're a small island developing state. We're very vulnerable to coastal inundation. Our sea levels will be rising. So some of the maps you looked at in some of the other countries, we have done similar kinds of works and know that we're going to be flooded, and a lot of our infrastructure is on our coastlines, or financial institutions, or tourism sector, all of that, or housing. So it means with our scenario planning has to consider all of these factors. Our national airports, those of you who have been to Jamaica know that our airport is on a sandspit, and therefore we're very vulnerable. How do we manage transport, migration, and all of those things at that level? Here we see Dominica, 27 Hurricane Maria. A man looking on, and he's thinking, how am I going to look after my family? How do I rebuild after this? Because his identity as the head of household, as the protector of his family, as the main breadwinner, which are these stereotypes that we train our men into, and the expectation is that he's going to somehow work a miracle and provide for his family. How will women as caregivers be able to look after their families when they have all their livelihoods destroyed? We see an image here from Hurricane Dorian, which in the Bahamas, a Cat 5. Now, the Bahamas doesn't have a lot of natural resources. It depends on tourism, and you'll see the devastation of their infrastructure as a result of Cat 5. So one of the concerns we have in our Caribbean region as small island developing states is that these severely and increased intensity of the hurricanes means that we are going to be very vulnerable. So our tourism sector is a mainstay for foreign exchange and for employment, but it is very vulnerable to shocks, internal and external shocks and environmental shocks. Another image here of ash from the Soufriere volcano, which erupted in St. Vincent in 2021, which completely covered cars in Barbados, thousands, hundreds of miles away, and you see the impact. Why is this important? It means that for health, those persons with asthma, with breathing problems, all of these, it means that caretaking is going to be even more significant. It's going to be more difficult. Health risks go up. I teach a group of family medicine practitioners, mainstreaming gender and health as a postgraduate program. And one of the things we looked at when this was happening is how is it impacting your clinics, your hospitals, and the health risks of your patients. So a volcanic eruption in one country has a significant impact on healthcare providers as well as individuals, men and women. And children with breathing problems are particularly vulnerable. Here another image, a man driving through ash. We look at the vulnerabilities and behaviors of men and women, for example. Men tend to be not as caring about their health, yes? So we look at the differential risks for them. They're less compliant. Research we have done in Guyana, for example, in floods, show that men were being severely affected by leptospirosis because they were walking in the dirty water, saving everybody, not putting on proper shoes or anything, but they were also not taking medication, so there were higher levels of death. And I'm saying you can use your knowledge of gender to intervene in health and improve as we cope with climate change and disasters. Another image here of one of the countries, and another one here of the volcanic eruption in St. Vincent and the Grenadines in 2021. So I wanted to share some case studies of work we have done, and one of the messages from this, and I want to really thank colleagues again for inviting me to come and share, is that our historical legacy of colonialism has left us in different language groups and cultural groups that we're still trying to overcome. And therefore, it is important for us as we move forward to make an even greater effort to collaborate. And I want us to think out of the box, as our colleague was saying yesterday. Artificial intelligence is something we're talking about a lot now, right? You can use the technology to actually translate, not to knock the translators, but the reality is, they've been doing an excellent job, but the reality is, rather than, and this is where I want, looking at Hopeton, because this is his area, he's done a lot of work on this area. How can we embrace the technology to our advantage? Yeah? Whether it is in terms of communication, in terms of doing the analysis and all of that. So I just wanted to share from the experience of the Institute for Gender Development Studies Mona unit, where I'm still an honorary research fellow, having served there for over 12 years as head of the department. And we were asked in 2009 by the UNDP and the Caribbean Risk Management Initiative to do research. We did 8 studies in 6 countries and in various sectors. What was the finding? The main finding is that people recognized and wanted to mainstreaming gender, but they didn't know how to do it. So in response, I developed a course on gender, climate change, and disaster risk management to build a capacity in the bachelor's degree program, which is the only bachelor's degree in gender and development across the Caribbean. And we drew on different sectors, different faculty, different disciplines to ensure that we were able to deliver this program. And the issue of knowledge sharing and capacity building is critical. So from that, we were able to, based on the findings and the publications out of that, we were able to do a number of other consultancies, even using some of our own students, because we're teaching them practical skills that they can use. It also enabled us to network and build partnerships within the university. You talk about the scientists, yes, the international relations personnel, right, the social scientists and so on. But we also, with the Disaster Risk Reduction Center, we have a Disaster Risk Reduction Center at Mona, and we have done a lot of work with them. It meant also that we worked with government. So when the government agencies are coming back from the COP meetings, we would be able to take our students for them to hear what's happening at the global level. They can see the importance of the linkage with what we're doing in the classroom, and we did in fact also take them out on field visits and things. But it builds another generation of younger people to be able to understand the importance of mainstreaming gender and climate change and disaster risk management. Also emphasizing that it is not just passing a course, but it is also your own survival. So some of the toolkits that the disaster management agencies, the climate change agencies have, we will be exposing them to this information. So they are building linkages with institutions that they can then see their future in terms of employment. Because for me, education is not something that you have and sit on it. You have to be able to use it, adapt it, and so on. So some of the research we did was funded by the Canadian government. So we developed this curriculum in response to the UNDP research findings, teaching them some of the same things we're doing. But we also ensured that we gave them practical experiences with institutions. And the high return on investment, as I see it, is that we have had over 200 students with a bachelor's degree in gender development who are equipped with skills to mainstream gender in climate change and disaster risk management. Out of those studies in Belize, Jamaica, Guyana, Dominica, the Dominican Republic, Suriname, there is information on sectors, mainstreaming gender in climate change and disaster risk management, looking at the impact of disasters on housing and agriculture and how we adapt. Now, out of that work, the Commonwealth Foundation, which is the NGO arm of the Commonwealth Secretariat, asked us to help with a number of conversations to build capacity of civil society organizations across the region. We have also done, and I'll speak a bit more on that later, but we have also done research on gender, age, climate change adaptation, and that involved research with women and men who are small farmers. We did training and a research manual, but also learned, for example, that males having lower literacy rates as small farmers meant you had to adapt the tools and the techniques you use to do training and build awareness. That's just an example. What we have done, or what we did, was to develop a working paper of students' essays, an edited volume, which then meant that they were leaving university with a first degree, but also a publication on gender and climate change. And we worked with the Frederick Ebert Stiftung to have that out. Then there were opportunities for conferences and other publications. Professor Philomena Steady in the US did a book on environmental justice in the new millennium, and we were able to make a contribution to that book. Then the Disaster Risk Reduction Center asked us to collaborate for this enhancing knowledge and capacity to integrate gender and comprehensive disaster management, the EKA CDM project. This, of course, involved research, developing knowledge tools and resources. So we ended up with a generic training manual and a strategy, which is online, but also developing similar tools for the tourism sector. So this provided opportunities to work with the Caribbean Tourism Organization, which was mandated to mainstream gender and climate change in their policies and programs. So that was a tool that was produced for the tourism sector. There are several conference presentations, and again, we use students to give them the confidence and capacity to deliver at conferences and share knowledge. With the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Agency in Barbados, we have helped to mainstream gender in SEDIMA's comprehensive disaster management strategy and programming framework, support gender mainstreaming in their policies, procedures, and strategies, but also helping in specific areas. And one of the specific areas is disaster needs assessment, mainstreaming gender in disaster needs assessment. So again, it's analyzing gender in this new plan, how gender roles affect pre-existing vulnerabilities, which we've been talking about, lower wages, higher unemployment, gender stereotypes, and all of these things that will impact your risk as well as your survival and recovery. And then we made recommendations to mainstream gender in disaster needs assessment process and tools. Their action plans, we looked at commitments and helped them to see how we could support them in mainstreaming gender in their management, disaster risk management, and in their comprehensive disaster strategy and programming framework, which means you're looking at scenarios around every single type of disaster which could occur and every type of hazard. They also had a think tank on gender vulnerable groups and disaster risk reduction. So again, this support of gender and disasters has related to what happens before, How do gender roles and responsibilities impact vulnerability, your perception of risk, during the emergency period, how you cope with, because we found differences in how women and men cope with the actual passing of disaster. Then there's rehabilitation and recovery. What are the specific needs? What are the new vulnerabilities that have been created? But also how you can prioritize and develop new gender roles and responsibilities. So for example, out of a disaster, we discovered that women can in fact learn construction skills. Construction skills, which is a traditionally male thing, right? Just one example. So when we're looking at gender socialization with disaster needs assessment, we're looking at the process of learning these gender roles, attitudes, and behaviors, and the interactions between these agents of socialization, the family, the school, churches, peers, and the media, but also cultural and social beliefs, right? For example, discovering that men wouldn't want to leave their farms because they're afraid of the, their houses, and that put them at risk, or wanting to protect their animals. It also looked at, in the gender analysis for the disaster needs assessment, it helped the team to assess the differential impact of the disaster on the two sexes because of their roles and responsibilities. And we looked at all of those intersecting factors. The issue of disaggregated data. What does the gender disaggregated data say when it is analyzed? Teaching them those basic skills. What are the vulnerabilities and needs of specific groups? And who should be given priority in those? And what are their specific needs and assets? So one of the things was early warning systems for diverse groups, males and females with disability. And I just pause to say that some of the work we have supported has involved working with deaf, the persons who are deaf and who are blind. So you're converting your tools to braille, for example, right? Which I think is so very important, because when we think of persons with disabilities, we think of a generic group, when in fact there are various differences, different groups. So a male with a disability is still a breadwinner, a female with a disability is still a caregiver, and she still has to do all of those things. And the children with disabilities will also have specific needs. So when you use your gender lens as a cross-cutting tool, it means you're targeting who needs what and being more specific. And you're doing your aerial reconnaissance to identify your socioeconomic data, to identify communities most at risk, and the households, the composition of those households in those areas. So you're drawing on the knowledge and experiences of the communities to be able to prepare for and do a needs assessment for to reduce risk and improve recovery. And of course, it's underscoring the importance of gender segregated data, age, sex, socioeconomic background, disability, sexual orientation, and religion. Analyzing the data is another skill. So having the data is one thing, but being able to analyze it, to understand what does this mean? What does this mean in very practical and everyday terms? What are the specific needs and vulnerabilities linked to these roles and inequalities? And then the DANA team would use this as part of their needs assessment. Now, it's important that the disaster needs assessment team is multidisciplinary, and especially with a gender specialist, and they're collecting both quantitative and qualitative data, and they're analyzing data to develop a gender-sensitive vulnerability profile and a very rich needs assessment. So it's not just a macro analysis, it is at the micro level specifically, right? We also help to integrate gender in their special standard operating procedures and the forms that they use. So even adapting these for the entire region was something that we were able to do. So for example, adding sex of household, we were talking earlier today about that. Adding that variable means that you're getting valuable knowledge in terms of how you're going to, what is the risk assessment for that household. And again, as we heard in the case of Cuba and the Dominican Republic, single female-headed households were more vulnerable, larger, poorer, they have more dependents, including young children. They're looking after their elderly and members who have a disability or are sick. Now, no male affects access to money to prepare for a disaster. They may have to access labor, additional labor, to repair damage. If there's no male in that household, they have to think about that, how to clear debris and stuff like that. Then the types of employment and occupations. And we heard earlier about the importance of understanding this gender division of labor in occupations and so on. We recognize that women are more likely to be in jobs that allow combining unpaid caregiving with paid caregiving. So what they're actually earning is less, and that is going to impact their ability to prepare for as well as recover from a disaster. And the sectors in which they're going to have job losses. I was particularly intrigued at the discussion this morning on the tourism sector, the gender division of labor in the tourism sector, because Hoopton and I have done actually a book and several studies on tourism, and People and Tourism is the title of it. And again, the disaggregated data. So I was echoing some of what we had found in that study. Housing needs. When you look at census data on housing, you see a gender profile. So using your census, your disaggregated data from the census can also tell you who is most vulnerable, who may have or may not have access to insurance. One of the findings is that older males are more likely to require residential care than older females. Anybody wants to hazard as to why?
They don't take care of themselves. Yeah, because they don't take care of themselves, what you were saying.
Yeah? Anybody else? Why are men likely to be more vulnerable and needing residential care? Again, if you look at the types of households, the structure of our households, or female-headed households, if the men are not always present, as they age, they're going to be more vulnerable and having to look after themselves, or someone is going to have to look after them. So you factor all of these things into the disaster planning and needs assessment, so you can prepare in advance to know that you're likely to have more males who will require residential care, so they're not left out, right? Then the disaster needs assessment also looked at immediate needs. You know, shelters. Shelters have to be gender sensitive. You need to recognize that you do not want to reinforce the risk of gender-based violence, sexual harassment, and all of these issues, and therefore you need to plan ahead. Then in terms of the kinds of food, you need to think of the diverse population groups that are there, age, persons who are older, persons who are, particularly in terms of some religious groups, are not going to eat certain things, health status, dietary special needs. Someone mentioned earlier the fact that if you're going to a shelter, you need to take your medication, right? Your bag of medication. If you don't have the medication, you have two disasters, right? Because that is a health care, that is an essential. And I want to underscore the fact that our region has a high percentage of non-communicable diseases. We have to factor that into our disaster management, right? And the special dietary needs and medication is critical. Then there's the issue of shelter for individuals and families, and also LGBTQI persons. Because of the stigma and discrimination, it means that some of those persons will be without shelter. That's another problem, right? Issues of safety and security, persons with disability, the kinds of buildings we're using, ensuring that there's not only ramps to get into the building, but how we construct our bathrooms, the spaces, all of these things, signage. So we have a far way to go, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm raising these things because I'm looking at gender as a cross-cutting issue in climate change and disaster risk management. It's not just about males and females and different sexual orientations. It's about what it means and the need for us to be prepared. Then there are the psychosocial needs which have to be taken into consideration. The research shows us that men and women have different coping skills when there's a disaster. Do we think of older males needing adult briefs, for example, Pampers? The fact that they, depression, or sometimes they're overlooked for food when food is being distributed, right? Because they're men, they can cope. Adolescents and adult males and boys, they have higher risk from protection and saving others, and therefore they need to target the messages to protect them, to protect themselves. And then males and females with disabilities are more vulnerable at several levels and require special needs. Personal hygiene kits. When I worked with UNFPA, I remember we got dignity kits, which required sanitary pads, right? If there's stress is likely to go up because, and therefore women might have stronger periods and so on. So dignity kits for women and men, women in adolescent females in their reproductive years is important. And it's not just access, but how you're going to dispose of those things carefully. Ensuring that your disaster needs assessment team includes gender balance in the leadership and the membership, ensuring that they have skills, gender mainstreaming and gender analysis and planning, but training in response to disasters for targeting persons with disabilities and diverse groups. We've worked with the disability sector in various ways, and I mentioned the issue of Braille and sign language as early warning systems and opportunities. Just wanted to kind of quickly go through one of the things we have done, a tool for the Commonwealth Gender Climate Change Analysis Tool for the Caribbean. So this was what the tool looked like. It's online if you're interested. And it started with conversations in Barbados in 2018. Then we had another conversation in Jamaica in 2019. And then we went virtual in 2020 when there was COVID, looking at how the tools were used. And these are just some images from the team. The lady in red, Kimberly Carr-Tobias, is one of the graduates from our gender course, bachelor's degree in gender, Jamaican, who became an important research assistant and even represented us at conferences in the blue ocean economy somewhere in the world. And she was a very key resource in helping us to develop the manuals and so on. This is one of the consultations that we had in Jamaica. The gentleman in the middle is from Antigua. He's a person with disability. The lady to the left is an indigenous woman. So the tool was developed by persons who are going to be using them. And this is just a picture of the conversation we had with the persons who validated the tool from different countries in the region as well as from the Commonwealth. Just moving quickly, just to mention that one of the things we did was also to use the arts to communicate. So Jean Brinter-Breeze and persons from the Pacific who came to Jamaica were able to do a play, Women Who Walk with Water, Performance and Conversation on Climate Change and Gender, which was produced at the end of Manly. So you had people from the Commonwealth coming out together to produce a play which was related to the themes of gender, climate change, and disasters. We have also done several publications, the working paper series, which I mentioned, I've done integrating men and masculinities in Caribbean disaster risk management. It's in a chapter in a book with Elaine Enarson and Bob Pease, and it underscored the need to increase the integration of men and masculinities in climate change and disaster risk management policies, programs, and strategies. And the focus was on men at the margins of society of Caribbean, small island developing states. We looked also at, this included men who have sex with men, LGBTQI, older males, homeless males, and looked at the implications for shelter management among other critical issues. So the key takeaways I want to leave with us is that if we use gender as a cross-cutting issue, it is a very useful tool to identify and address different kinds of vulnerabilities to climate change and disasters, but it is not all doom and gloom. You can, in fact, help to transform gender norms and behaviors and overcome stereotypes. So the crisis provides an opportunity to learn and recognize that you don't have to have stereotypical occupations. It also helps and can help to address the hierarchical and power imbalance, because when the rubber hits the road and you get into doing work in communities, you find that women are very capable, and as equally capable as men. Then mainstreaming gender and climate change in the policies and programs and strategies, we're saying it is essential to achieve sustainable development goals, particularly for us in small island developing states. And the investment can have a multiplier effect in transforming approaches to climate change adaptation strategies, disaster preparation, emergency response, recovery and reconstruction. And I'd say, end by saying there's scope for us to expand partnerships across these language barriers that have been historically created. So gender mainstreaming, let's go and get it done, and thank you very much.